What's up guys, and welcome to the fourth video in this C# tutorial series. So this video is going to concentrate on functions, and like I mentioned in the last video, functions are really the building blocks of a program. Okay, so they are meant to do jobs and to return values and to take in values, or maybe not to return any values. So we're going to go on all over that in this video and kind of just go over the basics of calling functions and creating them. Okay. So let's go ahead and create a new project, console application, as you're probably used to by now. And we'll call this one functions. So we have our template, and let's go ahead and dive into creating a function. Okay, so let's come down into our class still, and let's go ahead and make it public. Okay, so public is meaning that anything outside the class or inside the class can access it. Okay, so if you omitted any kind of accessor in C#, so if you did public void my function, then this means that this function can be called outside of this class. Okay, and we're going to get more into that, so don't worry, but I just wanted to mention that. Now if you omitted it and you left it out, that's okay. But C# is going to infer that as private. Okay, so everything is private by default. So if you did private, meaning that only this class can call this method. Okay, so if you have a variable of type program, then this is going to be able to call it, but nothing else. Okay, and then the last one, of course, is protected. Okay, and this meaning that this is for subclasses. So only things that are the class itself or things that inherit from that class can call my function. All right. So, but if you did private, like I said, and you just left it out, that's the same thing as declaring private, because everything in C# is private by default. Okay. And don't worry, we're going to get more into that, but I just wanted to make sure that we had an understanding of that before we moved on. So what is this method saying? This is saying, okay, I am public, so any class can call me. I am void, meaning that I don't return a value. Okay, so my function returns nothing. It just simply does a job. And my name is my function. And open close parentheses with nothing inside of it means I take in no parameters. Okay, so a public method that does a job, returns nothing. It's called my function, and it takes in no parameters. Okay, so what we can do is have a global variable to this class, int x. All right. And then what we can do is console.writeLine x. But before we do that, we're going to increment it. Okay, so every time I increment, and remember that this is now this is global to the entire class. So this method has no problem accessing. Okay, so the scope of it is basically the entire class. Now if I did int x here, or int say y, and I had an int y, so and if I try to use y here, it's not going to know what the heck I'm talking about, because it is now specified and it's local to this method right here. Okay, but because I declare x outside of any method and inside the class, it is global to the class. All right, so we can use x wherever we want inside of the program. Now that I have this my function basically increments x and then prints it out to the screen. Okay, so how to call a method? What we can do is do my function. Okay, and we simply call it there. But we're not going to be able to get to it, and that's because this is static. Okay, so the main has to be static, and that static means that static belongs to the class, not the instance. Okay, so like I said, we're going to get more into that, but just make sure that this is static so that you can actually call it. All right, so once we do my function, now it comes up, and the Intellisense says it takes in no parameters, and then we also need to make this static, and that'll go away. So this will actually run, and we can see that, don't forget the read line, of course. Let's run it, F5, and we can see that it printed out 1. Okay, so it incremented, this is default 0, and this incremented and then it printed it out. Okay, so we can call it again, no problem. And what it's going to do is increment it again and then print it out again. So it's calling my function twice, 1 then 2. And we can actually append a new line to it every time. That way it's not It doesn't look like 12, but it's actually on a new line, 1, then 2. All right. So that's the difference between right and right line. Is basically it just basically goes to the next line when you actually hit right line, where right will simply continue on the same line. All right. Now, what about when we want to return something? Okay, so we want actually to do something, do a job, but then we want it to actually return a value. And that's when we actually specify it here. We don't want it to be void, but we want it to return a value. So say if we wanted to return int, we wanted to return a string, we wanted to return a bool, or so on, okay? So let's say we wanted to return a bool. All right, so we wanted to determine if something's true or false, all right? And what happens is we get an error and it's saying, okay, you want to return a bool, but you haven't returned anything. So it says that not all code paths return a value. So just since we wanted to return a value now, it's the IDE, the compiler now is saying, okay, then you haven't returned a value, so I'm not going to compile until you do. All right, so we need to determine something, okay? So we can do something like if x is greater than 0, and we can do return true. However, otherwise, return false. All right. So that's going to make the error go away because no matter what we do, it's always going to return something. All right. Now, it's going to do the same thing here. All right. And it can if it wants. So it can actually output and then it returns true and then nothing happens because we're not doing anything with that value. Okay. So it's still doing a job and it's still returning something, but we're not doing anything with this value. So now what we can do is we can do bool, and then we can do is greater than 0 is what we'll name it. All right, we'll get rid of this one. So it will actually print out, and then it will return whether or not it's greater than 0, okay? And then what we can do is we can simply write that to the screen, okay? Is greater than 0. And then we can actually toString it, okay? So it's actually a string. All right? And that'll make the is greater than 0 variable to a string. And every object inside of .NET has a toString method, okay? And a lot of times we're going to want to override that in classes, which we're going to get to later in the tutorial series. So now that we have this, what is this doing? We're printing out something, and we're basically determining if something is true or not. And then we are returning that value, okay? And then we're printing it out. So we say true, okay? So what happened is it came into here, it incremented, then it said x is greater than 0, return true. So let's go ahead and step through this, okay? And another great thing to know about is stepping through your code, okay? And then to do that in Visual Studio is actually very easy. So what we can do is actually hit that line right there, and we can hit start, and it's gonna break right there, which means it's actually at this point, okay? So we can hit this button that says step over, okay? So it steps over that line of code. Then it checks this, x is greater than 0. So we know at this current time, it's 1. And then it returns true. And then of course, since it returned true, it needs to not execute the rest of the code. And then it comes into here, gets that value, and then writes it to the screen, okay? So I know this is pretty self-explanatory, and if I'm being a little too thorough, my apologies, but of course, better to explain it more thoroughly than to not explain it at all, right, is my opinion. So there you have it, okay? So the next thing we want to do is, what if we actually want to give it a value, okay? So we know that it returns a bool, it returns a value, but what if we want our function to take in a number of values and then determine something on those values or to do something with those values? And the way we do that is inside of these parentheses right here, okay? So what we can do is we can do int x and then int y. So this takes in two variables, both of type integer, x and y, okay? And this is local to the function, of course. And if you're used to programming, this is pretty self-explanatory, I'm sure, okay? Now, we can feed it any value we want, okay? So we can feed it, 4, 3 and 4, 3 and 3, whatever we want, and that'll work just fine, okay? So notice the Intellisense now helps us out, and it gives us right here, it says, okay, my function takes in an integer and another integer, okay? And in our case, when we're calling it, the name of it doesn't really matter to us right now, because basically whatever we get, it'll take on that name, okay? So let's do 3 and then 2. And then what we can do now is, instead of using this code, we could do if get rid of this right here. So now that X is now local to this code, what we can do is we can do if X is greater than Y, we'll say, then return true, otherwise return false. So obviously we know right off the bat, we can just look at it and say 3 is greater than 2, it's going to return true. And let's go ahead and do 2 and 3. We know that's going to return false. Let's go ahead and run it. Sure enough, it does. Our logic is correct. And there you have it. So obviously for brevity, it's really simple, I know, but simply gives the point across of how to take in parameters and then how to also return values based on those parameters or to do something else. Okay, so as you can see, if you are familiar with other programming languages, this really isn't too much different than any other language. Of course, if you are new to programming just in general, then this may be new to you, and this is how to segregate your code into different jobs. Okay, so just a little disclaimer on C#. As you learn, after these few videos, you're going to learn the really simple stuff. You're going to be like, this isn't really too much different from Java. This isn't really too different from C++. A few differences, but trust me, it's only when you get into like the really not advanced topics, but the little bit more intermediate topics, such as like events and delegates and lambda expressions and the functional side of C# and the syntactic sugar and just the way that you can really write elegant code that does a lot for a little. Okay, so you can do a lot of stuff with a little code, and it makes it really elegant and clean to use and clean to read. So once you really get into that and you start seeing that how C# works on a basis of on its own, basically from a different language, then you really start to see how it shines. Okay, so just keep that in mind while you guys are learning like the really basics of it, because of the fact that, of course, the basics are going to look a lot like in other languages, and it's not going to really be much difference. But trust me, once you get into more intermediate stuff, you really start to see how C# works and how it really shines and why it's used in so many different applications today. All right, but getting back on topic. Now this is the way a function basically looks in the signature. Okay, so mostly what its access level, its return type, which can be void, its name, and then its parameters. Okay, and the ID also lets you go ahead and collapse that into something basically that's all you need. So the signature is right here, but any of the definition is gone. So it's nice to be able to collapse it. And then you can also do that for an entire class or an entire namespace. All right, so that's helpful when you're trying to look at one thing inside of your program and you want to hide anything else because it's a little distracting or something. So just a little tip there. Now in the next video, we're going to actually take a look at how to implement the stuff that we learned into something a little cooler than what we've been doing. Okay, so I really want to have this tutorial series on something that it's not just how to do this, but more why to do it. And now that we learned this, here's what we can do with it. Okay, so this keeps it fun and interactive and really keeps it rewarding because you keep learning stuff, but then you keep seeing that you have these tools in your toolbox, and then, well, what can I do with them? And I'll do my best to show you how to implement some cool stuff. All right, and of course, if you have any comments, please leave them below. And if you have not already, please subscribe to my channel. It really helps me grow. And as always, thanks for watching, guys.